The sound is universal, but the ensuing chaos is specific. It is June 1968, and the long, slow, precious heat of a British summer is settling over the council estate. The children burst through the school gates, a sudden eruption of grey flannel, short trousers, and scraped knees. The sound of their freedom is unmistakable, the rhythmic slap of skipping ropes on cracked pavement, the clatter of a wooden hoop rolling down the hill, the communal chant of a forgotten street game. There is no immediate parental supervision. The freedom is absolute, governed only by the impending doom of the streetlights coming on. The air smells of hot asphalt, dry grass, and the faint, sweet dust from the local corner shop. This was a unique time, a childhood lived in the fading light of austerity, defined by simple, shared secrets. A secret code understood implicitly by every child who lived it. It was a language of simple toys, cheap sweets, strict rules, and monochrome television. A language that only a very specific generation can still speak. To speak the secret code of the 1960s British kid, one must first appreciate the world they inhabited, a world of glorious shared monochrome. The screen was small, often convex, encased in a polished wooden cabinet. The image itself was carried on a 405 line definition, often fuzzy, prone to ghosting from passing cars, and prone to breaking down into static. Crucially, there were only 2 channels for most of the decade, BBC and ITV. This limitation was, paradoxically, a unifying force. When the magic roundabout aired, the vast majority of the nation's children were watching it at the exact same moment. When the TV schedule ended and the screen defaulted to the steady hypnotic pattern of the test card, that image became a universal icon, a signal that childhood's official viewing time was over. This singular, shared media environment meant that jokes, characters, and catchphrases instantly became national currency. The culture was a vast communal water cooler. Outside of television, the technology of the home was slow, deliberate, and functional. Communication was a serious, measured process. The telephone was often a heavy black bakelite device, bolted to the wall in the hallway, reserved strictly for adult use. Dialing was an exercise in patience, a slow, mechanical grind as the rotary wheel returned to its place. There was no instant contact, no mobile messaging. A phone call was an event. This slower pace of technology mirrored the social structure. Authority was clear and absolute, while the swinging 60s and the rebellious energy of the mods and rockers dominated the headlines and the fashion magazines. The daily life of the average British child remained highly structured and respectful. Teachers were figures of unquestioned authority. The local bobby on the beat was someone you feared and obeyed, and the rules laid down by mum and dad were the laws of the land. The 1960s British kid was, therefore, caught in a unique historical space. They were post-austerity, meaning they had access to cheap, plentiful plastic toys and sweets, but they were pre-permissive, still living under the rigid social expectations forged by the war generation. This strict monochrome analog world created a need for external, physical outlets, and those outlets defined their memories. The crucial factor that forged the specific memories of the 1960s British child was the geography of freedom. Childhood was overwhelmingly an external activity. Housing estates, fields, alleyways, and even the local rubbish tips. These were the domains of the child. The low volume of traffic meant that the street itself was the primary communal playground, a vast, unsupervised arena for games like British Bulldog, Kirby, and heads down, thumbs up. Parents, having survived the war and the post-war grind, operated on a principle of benign neglect. Go out and play, be back when the streetlights come on. This single rule encompassed both absolute freedom and strict, unforgiving authority. This self-reliance fostered inventiveness. Lacking complex toys, children had to build dens, dam streams, and make their own fun with whatever simple materials they could find. Central to the social economy of the child was the corner shop. This was the financial and cultural centre of their world. Money operated on a miniature scale. The power of a penny or a threepenny bit was immense, allowing the purchase of penny sweets, blackjacks, fruit salads, or flying saucers, which provided a staggering level of choice for very little money. The interaction with the shopkeeper was a key rite of passage, teaching independence, basic arithmetic, and the social niceties of trade. This shared economy of cheap sweets and small transactions was a language of its own, understood universally by the era's youth. The rigour of the school system mirrored the home life. While the seeds of the comprehensive education reform were being sown, most kids still navigated a highly structured world governed by the 11+ exam and the clear hierarchy of the grammar or secondary modern school. Discipline was physical and verbal, delivered with the belief that a child's character was forged through strict external correction. This shared system of uniform, rules, and punishment created another layer of collective memory. This combination of structured external authority and complete physical freedom created a unique, self-contained world. The 20 things that only a 1960s kid understands are not random artifacts. They are the physical building blocks of a communal childhood that relied on resourcefulness, shared space, and a simple, analog reality. These shared experiences formed a secret, unspoken cultural language, a language we must now explore in detail. The tastes, rules, and domestic objects. The specific language of the 1960s kid was built on things that were tactile, cheap, and easily shared. The first chapter of the code resides in the corner shop economy, the sweet shop economy. 1. Blackjacks and fruit salads. This was the mandatory sticky double act of the sweet shop counter. The taste of aniseed mixed with the sudden, sharp, fruity tang of raspberry and pineapple. They were more than just sweets. They were a currency, costing just a halfpenny each. You bought them in bulk, staining your tongue and teeth with the proof of your purchase. 2. Penny chews and flying saucers. The ability to walk into a shop with a single copper penny and still emerge with a satisfactory haul was the magic of the era. The chews lasted forever, stretching the small financial transaction into a durable experience. The flying saucers, small flimsy rice paper discs filled with sour sherbet, were fleeting magical bursts of flavour. They defined the simple joy of low-cost consumption. 3. The sherbet fountain ritual. Not just a sweet, but an interactive, deliberate ritual. The tall, cylindrical yellow tube of fizzy sherbet topped with a stick of licorice. The challenge was managing the rate of consumption, dipping the licorice straw into the powder, letting it dissolve, and trying to reach the bottom without the licorice going mushy. This was the era's complicated, messy fun. 4. Sweet cigarettes, a deeply controversial memory today, but completely innocent then. The powdery white sticks, often tipped red to mimic embers. They were bought, pulled from the packet with exaggerated ease, and pretended to be smoked, a universal mimicry of adult behaviour that has since vanished entirely from childhood culture. 5. The brown paper bag. These sweets were never packaged in shiny plastic or resealable pouches. They were scooped from large glass jars by the shopkeeper and deposited into a simple, crinkly brown paper bag. The bag absorbed the warmth, the stickiness, and the various odours of the contents, making the packaging an inseparable part of the memory. School lunch realities. The school dinner hall was another landscape of universal experiences, often traumatic, occasionally glorious. 6. Semolina and pink custard, the ultimate sweet memory. School puddings were heavy, starch-laden, and designed for maximum fuel. Semolina, the thick, grainy hot sludge, was dreaded. But the glorious reward was the custard, scalding hot, luminous yellow, or sometimes bizarrely bright pink. This pink custard, poured over a jam roly-poly or a spotted dick, remains an indelible, bizarre memory. 7. The warm third of a pint, the absolute reality of school milk, delivered in small glass bottles, often left on a wire crate near the radiators until mid-morning. The resulting milk was not cold, refreshing, or palatable. It was slightly warm, creamy, and carried a subtle, sour taint of the room. It was compulsory, and the smell of warm milk in a classroom is a specific shared memory of the 1960s. 8. The specific smell of the hall, a blend of boiled cabbage, gravy, and disinfectant. This pervasive, distinct odour was the scent of public institution, a smell that instantly triggered a hunger for the simple, unsophisticated food that followed. 9. Dinner hall. Silence. The strict atmosphere. There were no discussions, no playing, and often an overwhelming pressure to finish everything on your plate. A fear of the formidable dinner lady, the ultimate enforcer of the clear your plate rule, was a universal truth. Domestic technology. The devices of the home were simple, functional, and anchored the family together, not separated them. 10. The rotary dial phone. The frustration of the slow, deliberate whir as the dial returned to 0. Calling a number with a 9 or a 0 felt like an age. The fact that the phone was fixed, often in a chilly hallway, meant privacy was non-existent and calls were brief and essential. 11. The bakelite radio. Before the television truly took hold, the radio, often encased in heavy brown bakelite, was the centre of family entertainment. It was the source of music, news and drama, gathering the family around a single voice in the evenings. 12. The TV test card, the true sign of the end of the day. When the official programming stopped, the screen would display the static image of the test card F, a geometric pattern, and the face of the young girl, Carol Hersey. The high-pitched electronic hum was the signal that playtime was over. The parents had taken over the living room, and bedtime was near. These 12 memories, from the simple pleasures of the sweet shop to the complex rituals of the home, were the very foundations of the 1960s British Code. But the remaining memories concern the essence of childhood itself, freedom and discipline. Playtime, media icons, and discipline, the final, and most indelible, part of the 1960s code concerns the raw mechanics of childhood itself, absolute freedom and absolute obedience. Outdoor freedom and the street code. The 1960s child possessed a vast, unsupervised territory unknown to modern children. 13. Making your own fun and building dens. Lacking the complex electronic toys of later generations, ingenuity was mandatory. Play involved sticks, stones, mud, and imagination. The ultimate achievement was building a den, a secret hidden space in the woods, under the bushes or on a local bomb site, a private kingdom built with scavenged materials that only the kids understood. 14. Street games and playground chants. Play was communal and self-regulated. Games like Kirby, throwing a ball across the road to hit the opposite curb, or the chaotic physicality of British Bulldog were universal. These games came with specific rules and rhymes that were passed down orally, creating an entirely self-contained secret culture, free from adult interference. 15. The Go Out and Play Edict. This was the foundational law of the 6-week summer holiday. The expectation was that you were outside from morning until the early evening. Parents rarely asked where you were, they only cared that you were not indoors causing trouble. This benign neglect fostered immense self-reliance and the ability to navigate minor social conflicts without adult intervention. 16. The ultimate curfew, streetlights, the universal, non-negotiable end of the day. The moment the orange sodium lights on the street began to hum and flicker into life was the signal for instant panicked flight home. The light, not the clock, was the master of their freedom. To be even 5 minutes late was a major infraction. Media icons and the code of the home. Even the simple media consumption was a uniquely shared experience, often blending into the domestic economy of the time. And 17. The specific dreaminess of the magic roundabout. Shown just before the 6 p.m. news, this French children's show became a mandatory viewing ritual. Its stop-motion animation and highly idiosyncratic characters, Dougal, Florence, Zebedee, provided a brief whimsical transition between the freedom of outdoor play and the solemnity of the adult evening news. 18. The Blue Peter economy. The iconic children's show provided endless practical inspiration, but it relied entirely on the domestic economy of reuse. Sticky back plastic, washing up liquid bottles, toilet roll tubes, and old cereal packets were the official building blocks of creativity. It taught children to see junk as material, reinforcing the make-do-and-mend mentality of their parents. 19. Discipline. Sayings, the threat of the threat. The specific verbal code used by parents and teachers that is now extinct. Phrases like, "You'll get a clip round the ear," "I'll give you something to cry about," or "Don't ask for trouble," were instant effective deterrents. They were not just warnings, they were cultural relics, understood to precede a physical action if the boundary was crossed again. 20. The slipper, the cane, and the ultimate instrument of last resort. In an era where physical discipline was accepted, the instruments were simple and functional. The threat of the slipper for the mother, or the cane for the teacher, was the ultimate enforcer of the entire code. These objects, simple and domestic, were the final proof that the rigid rules of the 1960s home were law. These 20 memories form a portrait of a childhood that, due to specific technological, cultural and political conditions, can only be understood by the generation who lived them. But even as this distinct world of shared experience reached its peak, the forces that would ultimately dissolve it were gathering strength. The unique shared world of the 1960s British kid was not destroyed by a single event, but by a series of technological and social erosions that began around 1969 and accelerated through the early 1970s. The first crack in the monochrome world was the arrival of colour television. BBC One began broadcasting in colour in 1969, but it was a slow, expensive shift. By the mid-1970s, however, colour sets were becoming commonplace. This seemingly small technological change fractured the cultural experience of childhood forever. The visual code was broken. No longer did the entire nation share the same fuzzy, grayscale image of Blue Peter. The colours of the clothes, the landscape and the set design were suddenly specific, vibrant and individual. This shattered the communal, simple visual reality that had anchored the decade. The world was suddenly more complex, less homogeneous, and inherently more distracting. Simultaneously, the traditional structure that shaped the school day began to dissolve. The comprehensive school movement, gaining significant momentum in the early 1970s, aimed to dismantle the rigid, class-based divide of the 11+ system, grammar versus secondary modern. The shared universal experience of uniform discipline, the stark academic pressure, and the clear class boundaries embedded in the old system began to fade. The collective universal experience of the school hall was replaced by an increasingly diverse, complex and localized structure. The social framework that held the 20 things code in place was being deliberately dismantled. This educational shift coincided with the tectonic change in the child's economic world. The sacred penny-sweet economy, the heart of the communal childhood experience, died. It was killed by rising inflation, the cost of labour, and the increasing market dominance of packaged branded goods. The sticky, cheap, mysterious delights scooped from jars were replaced by standardized, clean, foil-wrapped chocolate bars and brightly packaged crisps. The brown paper bag was replaced by shiny plastic. This transition was total. The child's small economic transaction was now controlled by multinational brands, not by the local shopkeeper. Childhood officially became a lucrative market targeted directly by sophisticated advertising. The analog tools of play also began their slow retreat. Expensive early electronic toys, from calculator watches to rudimentary home video games like Pong, began to appear in the houses of the affluent. These were toys designed for individual indoor consumption, requiring batteries and technology, not sticks and imagination. They hinted at a future where the secret code of street play would be replaced by the individualized high-speed code of the microchip. These external changes, from the screen in the living room to the sweets in the hand, opened the door for a much more profound shift, the dismantling of the essential, unsupervised outdoor freedom. If the advent of colour television fractured the visual culture of childhood, the surge in car ownership fundamentally destroyed its physical geography. Throughout the late 1960s and early 1970s, car ownership accelerated sharply. This was a symbol of new affluence and mobility, but it came at a profound cost to children's independence. The roads, which had functioned as the vast, unsupervised playground for generations, suddenly became fast, unpredictable, and lethal. The chaotic beauty of street play, games like Kirby and British Bulldog, became too dangerous to risk. Parents, naturally fearful of the rising statistics on traffic accidents, began a slow but decisive withdrawal of their children from the public domain. This fear was amplified by a new media narrative, the end of innocence. Stories of abductions and accidents, once local whispers, became national news through the very television sets that had just shifted to colour. The concept of stranger danger entered the public consciousness. This was a direct psychological attack on the benign neglect, parenting style of the 1960s. The implicit trust that children would look after themselves and that neighbours would look out for them evaporated. The result was the Great Retreat indoors. childhood was pulled inside the garden gate, into the relative safety of the home, or crucially into organised scheduled activities. The spontaneous self-regulated chaos of the street was replaced by brownies, cubs, supervised football practice and dance lessons, all requiring parental organisation and most importantly chauffeur service. This change marked the death of the self-contained secret culture of the street. The specific rhymes, the oral traditions, and the complex unwritten rules of Kirby died out because the kids were no longer there to pass them on. The communal nature of 1960s play was replaced by the individualized, supervised schedule of the 1970s kid. The freedom to roam for hours without check, a core pillar of the 1960s code, was gone forever, replaced by the question, where exactly are you going, and when will you be back? The unique 20 things that defined the 1960s child were products of a singular environment, a monochrome world of limited technology and maximum physical freedom. By the mid-1970s, that world was obsolete. The code was broken. The memory of the 1960s childhood became a lost language, difficult to translate for the new generations who grew up safer, but profoundly more constrained. The period of cultural erosion created a new character in the national story, the 1970s kid. This child grew up in a world profoundly different from their 1960s counterpart. They were safer, warmer due to the slow adoption of central heating, and vastly more aware of global trends. But they were also more confined, more supervised, and fundamentally more expensive. Childhood was no longer a realm of benign neglect. It became a target market. The sophisticated marketing techniques of the 1970s, amplified by the clearer, more distracting medium of colour television, began to target children directly. The ethos of making do was replaced by the relentless encouragement to buy now. The simple, communal economy of the corner shop withered and died. Penny sweets, products of local confectioners and small-scale thrift, were replaced by standardized, heavily branded packaged goods, massive Mars bars, crisps, and Americanized bubblegum. This shift was profound. It ended the era where a child's economic power lay in the accumulation of small copper coins, and began the era where their power lay in pester power directed at their parents. Leisure was increasingly something to be purchased and consumed indoors, not created outdoors with sticks and stones. The memories of the 1960s child, the specific sound of the Rotary dial, the unique smell of the test card, the rigid rules of the street, became increasingly meaningless to the new generation. The communal cultural touchstones that had unified 1960s kids began to fragment. The 1970s kid might watch Blue Peter, but they might also watch the Banana Splits from America. They played board games and later early video games rather than British Bulldog in the street. Their toys were not self-made dens, but plastic figures tied to international media franchises. This fragmentation of experience, the shift from a unified, limited reality to a diverse, globalized market, was the immediate consequence of the cultural turning point. But the most lasting impact of this change was the creation of a communication barrier between the generations. The most profound consequence of the cultural shift was the creation of a communication barrier that isolated the 1960s generation from their own children. Their memories, the 20 things that formed their code, were fundamentally untranslatable into the language of the 1980s and 90s. The younger generation grew up with button-dial phones, scheduled activities, and a multi-channel clear-colour television screen. How could a 1960s child, now a parent, explain the sheer, visceral terror of the slipper when their own child was grounded using the complex, abstract threat of losing access to a video game console? The emotional weight was lost. How could they explain the simple economic joy of getting 5 sweets for a penny when their child needed a pound coin just to buy a single, branded chocolate bar? The concept of true thrift and scarcity was alien, and how could they possibly describe the universal creamy, slightly sour taste of warm, third-of-a-pint school milk to a child who had only ever drunk cold, flavoured milk from a disposable carton? The sensory touchstone was gone. This barrier was not one of age, it was one of technology and obsolescence. The fundamental shared reference points had disappeared. The 1960s kid could not share the core of their childhood experience with their children. Their tales of building dens on bomb sites, of climbing trees unsupervised, or of fearing the teacher's cane were met not with empathy, but with bewilderment and sometimes quiet judgment about safety and parenting choices. This explains the isolation implicit in the title. Only a British kid who grew up in the 60s will understand. They became the sole custodians of a language that relied on obsolete physical and social structures. Their memories were not just old, they were incompatible with the new, safer, more constrained, and ultimately more individualized world of the late 20th century. The universal, communal childhood of the 1960s had been replaced by a fragmented experience shaped by parental wealth, the car, and the schedule. This left the older generation isolated, holding on to a precious yet untranslatable cultural treasure. The memories we have revisited, of penny sweets, the sound of the Rotary dial, the unquestioned authority of the streetlights, are the physical evidence of a vanished culture. They are not just historical footnotes, they are the fundamental building blocks of a specific kind of British identity. These 20 things existed because the world was simple, analogue, and limited. The lack of technology enforced a communal experience, and the lack of convenience enforced resilience. The code that bound the 1960s kid was a code of self-reliance, shared space, and resourcefulness. We, in the modern era, look back and often pity the lack of choice and the strictness. Yet the generation that grew up under those conditions, with the freedom to roam and the discipline to obey, developed an inner resourcefulness that their supervised, scheduled grandchildren often lack. The memories are not precious because the sweets were good or the rules were fair. They are precious because they represent a singular moment of communal unity, a childhood shared by almost every British child regardless of region or class, before that experience was fractured by technology, affluence, and fear. The only in the title is not a boast, it is an elegy. It is a recognition that the language of that communal childhood has gone silent. The 1960s kid holds the key to a quiet, resilient, and resourceful world, a world now locked away, preserved only in the poignant, untranslatable memories of the generation that lived it.